Just because we've all grown up with the movies and television does not mean that we have any particular sensitivity to interpreting visual images. We must not confuse familiarity with visual images with any kind of critical understanding. And the reason you're taking this course is to develop that kind of critical facility with film. Now, I ended the first half of our class by talking about an ideological approach to film, the kind of approach we are going to have in our class. And when I speak of film's ideological role, I do not mean that films indoctrinate viewers, at least not in any simple sense. It's not like The Manchurian Candidate, if you happen to see that. Movies are first and foremost entertainment. They are not doctrinaire lessons. For the most part, Hollywood films are explicitly apolitical. Politics is poison at the box office. And everyone in Hollywood knows that. As Samuel Goldwyn put it, if you want to send a message, call Western Union. Don't use his studio to send a message. Nevertheless, my argument is that films have powerful ideological effects. They send out important messages about how the world works. They help shape everything that we mean by common sense, or put somewhat differently, what the movies do is they shape what we think of as normal and what we think of as abnormal. They help shape our assumptions about who commits evil and why they do it. Our basic understanding of the world comes from the movies. And that's what I mean by ideology. Now let me give you two films that many of you have probably seen at some point that illustrate what I mean by ideology. One film is The Grapes of Wrath, film from the 1930s, based on the famous book by John Steinbeck. Another is the film Norma Ray, film from the 1970s. In many respects, these films are completely different. The Grapes of Wrath is a story of the lives of people caught up in the Dust Bowl of the 1930s who were forced from their homes on the Great Plains to California. And Norma Ray tells the story of Southern textile workers who go on strike in the 1960s. So they're about labor, broadly conceived, but seemingly have nothing in common, but they do. And what they have in common is ideology. Both films share certain underlying messages. They say that most workers are powerless, lazy, and fearful. They say that most labor problems can be solved by strong, charismatic, individualistic leaders. And that's what I mean by ideology. Not the storyline, not the plot, but the implicit message. One thing I'm going to argue to you is that all movies work on two levels. There is what I would call the manifest level, that's the visible level, the level that anyone can summarize. And then there is what I would call the latent level, the subterranean level, and that's very much the level that we're going to be preoccupied with in our class. Okay? So just as if you went to a psychoanalyst, you would tell the story of your dreams, and then the analyst would tell you what they really mean, we're going to be doing something quite similar in our course. Now, we've all heard the phrase, it's just a movie, right? It's nothing serious. It's nothing meaningful. It's just a movie. Movies, we're told again and again, are just entertainment. Don't take it so seriously. In one eye, out the other, right? Now, every semester when I teach this class, when we're hip deep in analyzing a film or a soap commercial, a hand will creep up in the very back. I'll call that person the assassin, and that person will just, in a meek voice, raise a question that would completely undermine the class, right? Aren't we reading too much into this? Isn't it just a movie? Isn't it just a trifle? Isn't it just insignificant? Now, usually I'd come up with some spur-of-the-pants answer to that question, sort of dismissing it, but it is a serious question, and it demands a serious answer. And so what I'm going to do next is try to give you my answer to that question when somebody nudges you at the movie theater and says, it's just a movie. Shut your yap. Okay. All right. Do you really think that every little thing in the film is there for a reason? We all know that in our everyday lives, lots of things happen because of accident. After all the misspellings that you've seen on my screen show are there, I can assure you, by accident, not because I don't know how to spell. Though that's another interpretation. So if in real life accidents happen, shouldn't accidents happen on the screen? I mean, we've all seen microphones hanging down on the screen. That must be an accident, right? I mean, they couldn't have done that on purpose. Accidents must happen. If I trip over a stone and that causes me to bump into someone, that jostling encounter, whatever a Freudian might say, was probably just an accident. It simply happened. It wasn't on purpose. It was just a random occurrence of the sort that happens all the time. It doesn't have any deeper significance. And there's a temptation to treat a film in exactly the same way, as if spontaneous things occur by chance. But I will assure you that nothing in a film happens by accident. Go to Hollywood sometime, somehow get yourself invited onto a set, and you will see nothing happens by accident. A Hollywood film is one of the most highly scrutinized, carefully constructed, least random works imaginable. Now, if you watch Entertainment Tonight, you already know that. You know that very careful planning takes place. When they film a movie, they don't film it in order. That's too expensive to do. They have what's called a continuity script, which locates all the scenes that are in the same place together so they can all be filmed at once. That requires incredible planning. That is, the entire film had to be thought through first. We all know it takes thousands of people to create a blockbuster film. Directors, actors, actresses, grips, gaffers, and on and on and on. Producing a film is a highly coordinated effort. And it's not done by amateurs. It's done by dedicated professionals. But to most of us, it's a bit of a mystery what all those people do. When we start watching a film, we are encouraged to forget that all this is a huge collective effort. Maybe we remember that an Alfred Hitchcock movie was directed by Alfred Hitchcock because he appears on the screen momentarily. But in general, what Hollywood asks you to do is to forget everything except the story being told on the screen. We'll talk more about this next week. But the film is even filmed so that you are sitting straight in the center of the action, looking at the action. Everything is designed to create an illusion. Okay? So you're not aware of the behind-the-scenes effort that brought us the story and the world that Hollywood created. If you want to see movies that look self-consciously manufactured, then you see avant-garde films. But you don't see Hollywood films. We tend to forget the thousands of minute decisions that consciously construct the artificial world of the movies. When I put on a shirt in the morning, I do so with little thought. I often put on the wrong shirt. But a movie's character shirt is chosen by a specialist, a professional whose sole job is to figure out what kind of shirt that character should be wearing. Someone who has far better taste than I in choosing a shirt. Similar decisions are made for props. Similar decisions are made for sound, for cutting, and on and on. Indeed, filmmakers work hard to exclude everything that is random from their fictional world. Often, it would be cheaper to film a film on location than to build an extremely complex and expensive set. But on a set, you can control everything. They don't necessarily want an actor or an actress who looks in real life like the character on the screen. They want to be able to shape that character to look just like what they want. So if you see Becoming John Malkovich, this is a director's dream, to be able to make characters look how the director wants, not how the characters look in reality. So sets are built so filmmakers can have absolute control over an environment. The crew spends a great deal of time and expense between shots adjusting the lighting so that each shot looks as polished as possible. It has to be perfect. When filmmakers do want something to appear random in the film, they carefully choreograph this random appearing behavior. It's no accident. It's not truly random. It is a creation. For instance, extras who are merely walking by the main character are told what to do and which way to behave in order to appear natural. It's anything but natural. Even seemingly random events and minute details in a film are chosen and are staged. Oh, but we know that there are directors who tell us that they don't want things planned. They don't want to sanitize their films. They want to give us real life, not a script. They want to bring the real world into their films, they tell us on those TV shows. Or what about Dustin Hoffman or Robin Williams, actors who love to improvise, who love to break away from a script? Is what they're doing random? Is what they're doing left to chance? What's your answer?
I remember hearing a story about one of the funniest scenes I've ever seen on film. In the first Indiana Jones film, where he's standing in the lot with the sword, the guy with the sword and so forth, and he takes out the gun and it's shit and shoots him dead. that only happened because Harrison Ford had 104 fever. He didn't want to work that day. He came out on the set and figured out a way to make it end. Now, there was a choice made there to leave it that way. They could have refilmed it. But the occurrence of it was random. It wasn't, whether the story's true or not, I couldn't vouch for. But the occurrence of it was a random occurrence, not planned for, crew didn't know, nothing.
There may be cases like that, but they're very, very infrequent.
I can think of an actor who likes to improvise. That's Jim Carrey. And there's The Mask, which is a very choreographed, stick-to-the-regimen film, was a big success. Now, there are other films he's made, like Dumb and Dumber, which he was allowed to improvise a lot, and he got real hokey on that. And as a result, I don't think it did as well as The Mask did, or any of his other films where he's under control a little bit more. So sticking to the regimen is important and necessary.
Okay, and we all know about documentary filmmakers like Fred Weissman who make films that don't have scripts at all. And they seem to be examples, right, of real-life films. But what I'm going to argue to you is even when the kind of improvisation that you're referring to occurs, the movies still aren't random. They're still highly controlled items. Filmmakers and editors look over every bit of outtake. They carefully choose which scenes they're going to put in and which they're not. That choice is what makes the movie you see. They're filming much, much, much more than they're ever going to put on the screen. And then they create their movie. And when they assemble the real movie, the movie they want you to see, that's not random chance any longer. That is careful construction. Now, they have to work with what they got, unless they call up George Lucas and have him create something for them. But still, they're making conscious choices, and that's the point I want to stress. They do so with the same scrutiny that was applied to the actual filming. Just as much time is spent on editing a film, often more time, than is spent on shooting the film, because that's when the film is constructed. Even if something occurred on film without their planning, they now make a conscious choice to use that chance occurrence. So again, my theme is nothing is left to chance. Come on. Do film professionals from editors to set designers really spend all their time scrutinizing the details? Yes. The answer is simple. A Hollywood blockbuster may cost up to $200 million. The average film now costs around $80 or $90 million. If you were going to make something that costs that much, wouldn't you scrutinize every detail in that item? And couldn't you afford to do it? Couldn't you have people watching every detail? No accidents in movies. Everything is watched carefully. Even a cheap, inexpensive movie costs $10 million. I mean, imagine on this campus $10 million would build a new classroom building. I mean, this is not chicken feed that we're talking about. This is very significant amount of money even in these days of inflation. With so much money riding on a film, the scrutiny is enormous and extends to every level. Of course, this process, like any process, is fallible. Mistakes do creep in. Extras in a movie about ancient Rome might be seen wearing wrist watches. But even that's usually intentional and not an accident. Yes?
I was going to say the movie Three Men and a Baby supposedly had this ghost in the background because you can see this boy or someone that looks like he's real faint. And yet you're wondering, well, did the producer stick him in there and make up this story so that more people would go see the movie?
And the answer would be obviously yes. All too often, beginning film scholars have a tendency to assume that odd moments in a film are a mistake when the opposite assumption is more likely to be true. Nothing in a final film is there without having been examined by scores of professionals who have carefully chosen the components. You can trust that if something is in a film, it's there on purpose. Books are written by individuals, but movies are team products. They are created by collectivities, not by one person. And so nothing is there by chance or by accident. Okay, so the director really cares about the details. But do you think your interpretation is what the movie maker really meant to say? And this is, I think, a very difficult question to answer. In high school English classes, you may be taught to look for the meaning of a literary work. Often they'll tell you in freshman comp, find that one sentence that summarizes the whole meaning of that short story that you just read. And so you come up with a single line that you can nudge your classmate with. Macbeth is about greed, greed. So that when you get called upon, you know to say, oh, greed is the answer. But that wasn't my question, unfortunately. So often with something written by a single author, it is possible to identify a single overarching theme. One can reduce a literary work or a film to its message, but that makes the game of interpretation exceedingly simple, and I would add, simple-minded. All we're trying to do is to figure out what an author or director was trying to say. But a movie is not a telegram. A movie is sending out complex, often contradictory messages. And one of our tasks is to try to uncover those messages. Some filmmakers have scoffed at the idea that their movies contain messages. What is at issue here is not simply what the director says, but what we can see. It's the viewer, the recipient, that's important, not what the author says. Alfred Hitchcock made a career of trying to get people to underestimate him. He made a career of trying to get people to see the most simple-minded interpretation of something that was very complex. Just to give you an example, many of you have seen the movie North by Northwest. And of course, there's a line in the movie about Northwest Airlines, right? And so the people in the audience think, I got the message. That's what he's referring to. Of course, that's not what he's referring to. North by Northwest is a line from Hamlet, and it has to do with sanity and insanity. North by Northwest, I'm sane, but from South by Southeast, I'm not sane. These are games that are played with us. Directors love to toy with their audiences, and one of our jobs is to overcome that toying. The traditional understanding of speech considers a sender trying to send a message to a receiver. Sender, message, receiver. Okay, that's the most simple-minded model of communication. A sender has a clear intention of what she or he wants to get across to the receiver, but sometimes the message doesn't get through, right? the receiver misunderstands the message, or there was some sort of interference. And so what we're simply trying to do under this model, this SMR model, is to clarify the message. The receiver tries to understand the message but misunderstands for a variety of reasons. And so, under this simplistic model, we compare the sender's intentions with the receiver's understandings, and we can then figure out how effective the communication was. And that can work for telegrams, and it can't work for movies. If a receiver gets a telegram asking for bail money, then starts collecting the necessary cash, then a successful communication has taken place. But again, we can't conceptualize a movie that way. It's not simply sender, message, receiver. It's something else. To see how effective the film is, one could compare the filmmaker's intentions with our interpretation and see if we got it. I mean, that may work in freshman comp where they tell you, but you got the story all wrong. Check. If the audience didn't receive the message, then perhaps the film is poorly made, or perhaps the viewer is not very savvy. Films, plays, and novels are not telegrams. They're emphatically and infinitely more complicated. So one of the first things I want you to avoid is assuming that a film has a single message, rosebud, and that if you get that message, you understand the film. To do so is to treat a film as if it was a telegram, which it is not. The cinema is a richer form of communication than can be conceptualized by the sender, message, receiver model. So then, how should we think about a film? If it can't just be sender, message, receiver, what would be a better model? Any thoughts? Okay, but how do I and the audience send a message to the screen?
Well, you do, in terms of how you interpret the
Oh, you have to press your button.
You do in terms of how you interpret the rest of the movie. There is some interactivity that goes on, and the message may change depending on what the first message you received was. So that what's on the screen is static, but what I see and he sees are four different things.
Okay, let's try to carry through on this idea. Filmmakers aren't, of course, sending just one message. They're often sending several messages. If we figure out what those messages are, have we got it? No. First of all, there's the question of who the author of a film is. Is the author the director? Is the author the screenwriter? Is the author the producer? Is the author the actor? There's lots of authors in a film. Thousands of people are working on a film. So whose message is it that we're trying to receive? If all of them are trying to convey meaning, and they all are, then we have to consider their combined intentions, which is an awful lot, right? Or if some people's contributions are more important than others, then we also have to understand the sum total of their intentions. And still, we don't wholly understand the film. The question of a film's authorship is very thorny, I would argue to you. We know who wrote a book, though in fact often editors play a very crucial role in creating the book that you actually read, but you can at least limit the number of authors. But with movies, you can't do that. With movies, there are multiple creators, each with her or his own intentions. And so our great challenge is to try to uncover those meanings and intentions. Let's assume we make it easy on ourselves. Let's assume that the author or filmmaker of a movie is the person who is in charge of coordinating all decisions in the shooting process. That is, the director. If we can figure out what the director intends, then we've got it right. Yes? If we could interview Hitchcock and gain an understanding of what was going through his mind when he made a film like Vertigo, then we would have gained a pretty solid hold on the film. Yes? No. We can never reduce a film to what people consciously intend, because people have subconscious or even unconscious intentions that they may be blind to, but we're capable of seeing. And that is one of the great challenges of interpretation. Interpretations, it's very difficult to falsify because they're not based on what people consciously intended always, but often on what they subconsciously or even unconsciously sought. At times, we all express beliefs, attitudes, and assumptions of our time without necessarily being conscious of doing so. If you watch enough Hitchcock movies, you will see that they often have figures that are often referred to as the icy blonde. They are characters who are aloof, who are unapproachable, and clearly it reflects something about Hitchcock. But I doubt that Alfred Hitchcock would have been able to explain it to you precisely what he found both appealing and disturbing about those characters. It's subconscious or unconscious, and yet it's crucial if we're going to understand his film. And maybe it doesn't just have to do with his psyche. Maybe it has to do with something about post-war culture. And it said something about men in the 1950s. Again, we can't just attribute it to one person. And our interpretation is what is crucial. Sometimes the ideology of our day speaks through us with little awareness on our part. We can unconsciously express our attitudes about personal issues as well as social attitudes and political beliefs. So our great challenge is to try to come up with interpretations that make sense even when there's nothing you can necessarily point to prove that they're right. Okay. Now, many believe that the unconscious seeks to express painful things that we have repressed and buried within ourselves. And we are going to use some of this language, some of this technique to understand the movies. If you have deep-seated conflicts, even conflicts that you are not well aware of, they will be expressed in a variety of ways. They might be expressed in your dreams. They might be expressed in unconscious behaviors. This is what Sigmund Freud meant when he talked about the psychopathology of everyday life. That is, you have tensions that you're not well aware of that get expressed in ways that you might not be sensitive to, but people all around you can detect. Okay? We have to do the same thing through film. These tensions can emerge in our everyday lives through dreams or Freudian slips or the artwork that we make. And so what I would try to suggest to you is that when a film truly touches home, when a film really connects with an audience, it's because it's giving conscious expression to a tension that people feel, but found it very hard to articulate or recognize. Okay? So that films serve much the same way dreams serve. They allow us to project and externalize tensions that we might find it too painful to see in our real lives. So what films are is the free-floating world of fantasy, where our deepest fears, deepest aspirations, deepest fantasies get played out. And our job is to recover those, just as a psychoanalyst would examine your psyche. Perhaps Hitchcock was unconsciously working through his own personal obsession with cool, aloof women in ways that he didn't understand as he made a film like Vertigo or Rear Window. Since human beings cannot be reduced to their conscious thoughts, films should not be reduced to the director's conscious intentions. We have to also uncover the subconscious and unconscious intentions. Okay, so if we get a sense of what the director's conscious intentions are, what ideological beliefs the director gained through socialization, and what the director's unconscious issues are, then we're arrived at a well-grounded, comprehensive description of what the film's trying to communicate. Right? Wrong. We have, if we stay within the sender, message, receiver model. That SMR model works for telegrams. It does not work for movies. Our job is to step outside of that model. Our job is to see if we can come up with a better approach. Why should we limit the viewer to making only those meanings which come directly from the sender, that is, from the filmmaker? If we get a meaning out of a film, even if it's not what the director intended, then that film's meaningful for us. After all, we all have experience that's very different from the film director. For one thing, you'll have had the benefits of the rich University of Houston education. Many filmmakers have not. They've had much more narrow, highly specialized training. So you could see things that a filmmaker, again, might not see. In other words, why should a filmmaker have any more authority over interpreting a film than you do? And the answer is there's not a reason in the world. You have as much right to project your meanings on the screen as the filmmaker has to project his or her meanings on your eyes. Someone might say, because the director's the filmmaker, it's the director's movie. No, it's your movie. You're the one who paid to see it. It's your movie, too. If you let go of the notion of a filmmaker trying to convey a message, then it's the audience's activity to interpret the film. You interpret a film according to your lives, your experiences, your tastes, your cultural framework, not the filmmakers. So our job is not simply to understand what filmmakers intended, it's to understand the meanings that we are able to decipher. Our activity is just as valid as the filmmakers. Most of us will never make a movie, unless it's a home movie, and no one will see it. but we too can be creative. But the kind of creativity that we can do is the creativity of interpretation. It's not what we do in most of our lives. In most of our everyday lives, we are guilty of the crime I will call passive viewing. Our society wants us to be passive spectators. Our society may talk about interactivity, but the reason that AOL merged with Time Warner was not to make consumers active, but rather to control the content that bombards you every day of your life. Because if people can control the content, then maybe they can affect the way you think. Maybe they can find ways to get you to consume the products that they would prefer you to consume. What I want to do in this class is to reverse that process, to change you from passive viewers into active interpreters who are able to gaze on what's put in front of you and then see what's truly going on. To, in other words, reverse the relationship with the director and the producer and make yourself the one in control, to be the one in charge. Again, everything in our society wants to discourage that. In this classroom, you may have microphones with little buttons that you can hold down. But basically, we've arranged this class so that you'll be passive and I'll be active. Now, we're going to do everything we can to try to invert and disrupt that process. But if you're at home watching this class on television, you can call me the next day, but you can't call me to ask a question while this is going on. But again, our goal has to be to move away from passive viewing and move towards active interpretation. The meaning of a film does not lie simply within the film itself. The meaning lies in the interaction between the viewer and the film. Okay, and that's one thing that we need to encourage. Indeed, as we learn more and more about how film audiences interpret a movie, we discover that the audience often has a very different interpretation than the filmmaker. Now, most often that happens when we think of something as funny that the director thought of as serious, but messages are always interpreted by the audience. And it's not just funny or crude examples. One of the most striking has to do with the movie Rambo. Rambo was not simply a hit in the United States where Sylvester Stallone won the Vietnam War single-handedly when we got to fight it a second time, but it was popular all across the world. And those people often saw it either silent or dubbed or with subtitles that had nothing at all to do with the text that Hollywood had put together. The movie was completely rewritten for those audiences, and the audiences themselves reinterpreted the movie. This goes on in a less controlled fashion every time you go to the movies. You see the movie that you want to see, not necessarily the movie that was created for you. Again, movie makers try to control that. That's why they reprint movie reviews in the newspaper. They're trying to frame the way you see a picture. But in practice, that's not what happens. You see the picture you see, not the picture they want you to see necessarily. If we consider your interpretation less valid than the filmmakers, then we lose a lot of the complexity of how movies work. If we discard your interpretation, then we lose sight of the way people make meaning. We lose sight of the way people gain pleasure in our society. Okay. But those audiences are just reading into films, right? So let's think for a moment what that phrase, reading into, really means. That's simple, you might reply. It's when an audience puts things into a movie that aren't there. That seems straightforward enough. If you add something to a movie that wasn't there, then maybe you should see that psychoanalyst that I was talking about earlier. So let's take an example. Every one of you has probably seen a horror film like the following. You have a group of teenagers staying at a spooky cabin deep in the woods. It's midnight. A couple sneaks off to a back bedroom and has sex. The attractive young woman then gets up, decides that she's going to take a shower, and she says she'll be right back. And you know that in a matter of moments, she will be toast. Now, how do you know that? Psychosense? Or is there something else going on? How is it that you know what's going to happen? Oh, press your buttons, people.
Happened in part one.
What do you think? What's going on?
They don't change their script. It's the same recycled, pathetic nonsense every time out.
Okay, so there are genre conventions, right, that you are aware of even before you see the film. Please.
I was going to say the bad girls always get it, and the good girls are usually the ones that survive to the end.
Well, we're going to talk about gender and horror films eventually, but again, you're seeing both an ideological message, as you're suggesting, and you're seeing genre conventions being played out. There's nothing in the film that tells you that the woman is going to be murdered, but everyone in the audience knows it's going to happen. And the filmmaker depends on your knowing that, right? It wouldn't be so easy to make a film if you didn't assume that, or she didn't assume that. The same incident, romantic, rural location, sexy couple, could take place in a romantic film with Julia Roberts, and the shower would not raise any hackles. No, the knowledge of her imminent death comes from you, not from the script. You have read into the film. Like the characters in Scream, you know that horror films operate according to a set of rules or conventions that have been established by previous films in the genre. The filmmaker depends on you knowing those conventions. The director knows that by sending the woman to the shower, a filmmaker can create tension in the audience. No, don't go, right? That's how it works. So reading into a film is expected. It's not unexpected. The filmmaker can toy with the audience, delay the inevitable, because the director knows we expect the woman to be slashed. It's our job as audience members to read into the scene. Filmmakers count on that. Movies rely on audiences to supply information that is only hinted at, like the shower convention in horror films. This reading into even occurs at the simplest levels of filmmaking. So don't dismiss reading into films. We do it all the time. When we see a shot of someone getting into a car and driving away, followed by a shot of the car pulling into another driveway, we understand that the driver went from space to space, from location to location. We understand this without the film actually showing us the drive across town. But that depends on you reading into the film, right? It's simple, but we do it all the time. Even children have to be taught how to do that, right? If we were limited to what was explicitly laid out in the film, if we didn't read into the film, then we wouldn't be able to make any sense of the movie. There's not a choice of whether you read into a film or not. Audiences always read into a movie. Now, of course, this isn't to say that you can read a movie in any way that you wish. Certain pieces of information in a film are established beyond dispute. And when I ask you questions on your midterm, you're going to give me the right answers, and you're not just going to make up something on the spur of the moment. If you don't think that Raiders of the Lost Ark is about an explorer archaeologist looking for the Ark of the Covenant, then you missed something, and you probably should see the film again. If you believe it is a film about Arctic beekeeping, then you are doing a remarkably perverse bit of reading into. So you can have pedestrian kinds of reading into. They moved across town by car. Some would call this inference or expectation. And then ludicrous kinds of reading into. Raiders of the Lost Ark as Arctic beekeeping. There are a very wide range of possible readings. And I can assure you that you're going to believe that many of my interpretations are far-fetched. But we're going to talk about them, and we're going to try to make sense of what interpretations do make sense and which ones do not. But what I'd like to ask you all to do is to be open to the possibility of interpretations that are far-fetched but are interesting, that make you see a film in an entirely new way, that sort of expand your mind and allow you to be more creative in the way you view films. Don't close down your mind simply because an interpretation involves reading into a movie. All film viewings involve reading into. Instead, look at a film with an open mind and see if there is evidence to support a particular interpretation. Okay, so maybe I see the value of coming up with a new interpretation of Hamlet or even Citizen Kane. But Raiders of the Lost Ark or Evil Dead 2? Aren't you taking these a bit too seriously? After all, they're just movies. You wouldn't say, why are you analyzing Hamlet? After all, it's just Shakespeare. So why is it okay to analyze Shakespeare and not Evil Dead 2? Okay. Now, the obvious answer is that some works are high class and some works are low class. In other words, it's the social status of a particular work that seems to be the difference about whether we're going to take it seriously or not. What's interesting is that even Shakespeare was once popular culture. Even in the 19th century, the 1800s, Shakespeare was widely performed and parodied. You might remember from Huckleberry Finn that that's exactly what goes on. In other words, even things that we now treat seriously weren't necessarily treated with the same obeisance as now. There was a time when the study of Shakespeare would have been questioned as not being serious enough. At first, scholars in the West didn't believe that anything written in English was worthy of study as the classics written in Greek. To give you an illustration of this, Oxford University in England only in the 1980s for the first time taught American literature. American literature was not considered serious enough for anyone to study. So they didn't hire professors to teach American literature. Homer, Sophocles, Aristotle, these were serious works which should be taught in school, not Shakespeare's plays or Charles Dickens's novels. In the 19th century, people would have laughed at you if you had said that Charles Dickens's works were appropriate for us to study. It would have seemed like a scandal. Such trash obviously could not withstand the scrutiny applied to great works like Homer's Odyssey or It Must Have Seemed. So instead of relying purely on what society tells you is deserving of interpretation, I think we should look at the works that we find interesting. This is a philosophy that I call populist chic. That is, if you like it, then it's worth considering why you like it. It's worth considering how and why it speaks to you. It's worth considering what underlying needs it meets that somehow tap into you. If you're going to understand yourself, and I believe that the entire reason for a college education is psychological self-awareness, then you would do well to look at The Evil Dead and those other films that influence your thought and your mind. If we look for rich interpretations of a work, we may find them, or maybe we won't. The point is, don't simply dismiss this process by saying it's just a movie, it's just The Evil Dead 2. Okay. Our job is to look seriously and see if we come up with anything, or else discover that it simply is trash that should be dismissed. If your analysis produces insightful, well-grounded interpretations in a film, then that film is infinitely fruitful for analyzing, even if it's titled Evil Dead 2. And that's, of course, what I thought about that Shield soap commercial. It's just 30 seconds long, but I think it sends us crucial messages about ourselves. A cops and robbers show may seem meaningless, but we can uncover meanings that tell us about ourselves. And that's the purpose that you're here in college to begin with. All cultural products have cultural meaning. But those meanings are not self-evident. Those meanings are not obvious. They only become clear as you interpret them. Okay? You are the artist, not the director, not the producer. But some people say that you shouldn't ought to do this because you'll simply ruin the movie. If you apply serious academic analytical tools to Evil Dead 2, then Evil Dead 2 won't be any fun to go to anymore, right? You'll kill the pleasure. Sometimes it seems like the surest way to ruin a good book is to assign it to a class, and it no longer seems like a very good book. English classes, after all, are supposed to make you read things that you wouldn't normally pick up by yourself. They force you to read Chaucer. They force you to read James Joyce. And hopefully that process adds something to your life. But they don't have you read Scott Turow, And they don't have you read romances, right? The things that we pick up by ourselves. But that's different than reading Michael Crichton or John Grisham in the airport. There, you're explicitly trying to escape. If we start thinking too hard about an airport novel or a mainstream film, doesn't it ruin it? I don't think so. Okay. I think that we can enrich the film-going experience if you begin to see them as cultural texts, cultural documents. You begin to think about the plot's social, political, and psychological implications. You can admire the film's structure, the way it plays with genre conventions. You can add the pleasure of analysis to the pleasure of movie-going. After this course, I believe that you will respond more fully to the movies than you did before you started analyzing films. You will feel joy at a well-composed shot, a tautly constructive narrative structure, and innovative social commentary. You'll not simply find out who did it. You'll also find out why that film works, why it has impact on your life, how it speaks to you. It's not just trash anymore. It's now garbage. Now, the outcome we hope for in a film analysis class is not to ruin the film for you, but to increase the complexity of your enjoyment. So you can see a movie better than someone who's 12 years old, Hollywood's prime audience. Why tinker with the simple pleasure of watching a movie? This question goes, of course, to the very foundation of what an education is. My basic faith is that the unexamined life will be a pretty vapid and empty life, and that an examined life will be fuller and richer and more complicated. It will give you more happiness in the end. Now, how do we know that self-examination is better than the bliss of simple ignorance? Like most statements of faith, there's no way to prove it. There's a wonderful scene in the movie of Annie Hall when Woody Allen walks up to two people, one of whom is actually my cousin, who are, the man's extremely handsome and the woman is extremely beautiful. And he asks them what they're thinking about, and she says that she's thinking about nothing. And he says something about how their lives are so empty, and it makes Woody Allen feel so good because it makes him feel superior to these people. Well, that's just how I want you to feel, superior to everyone else who may be handsomer or more beautiful and live better than you do, but live empty lives. By being in a college classroom, you have allied yourself with those of us who believe that if you don't examine the forces shaping your life, you will become subject to them. You can go through your life merely responding to movies, but if you are an educated person, you will also want to think about them, about what they mean, and about how they are constructed. In doing so, I'll assure you, you'll get pleasures and insights that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So this course is built around a very simple idea, that films are not merely forms of mass entertainment, they are cultural artifacts that reflect and shape our values. Films carry ideologies, and we have the power to expose those ideologies. Films are cultural seismographs that offer a graphic record of a changing culture. Movies provide a treasure chest of insights into American values, beliefs, and behavior. So if you don't go to the new film wall at Blockbuster and instead you want to see something made a few years ago, you'll begin to understand what that film says, how it contributed to the growth of movies, and how it can transport you into a different world, a world that you don't live in reality, but you can live in mentally. I'm going to argue in this class that the traditional highbrow dismissal of film is ignorant, and worse yet, it's dangerous. We live in a world in which the visual image is the dominant mode of communication. Visual imagery influences everything from political campaigns to what we eat for breakfast. In this class, we're going to learn about the growing importance of visual images during the last century, and we're going to learn how to interpret those images. Film is a type of communications with its own rules and grammar and meaning. And while films can affect you, even if you know nothing about that, films can affect you at a much deeper level if you do know something about that. Just as we have to learn written language, we have to learn to read the images and sounds that compose a film text. And in our class, you will learn to develop the tools to read, analyze, and understand visual texts. I call that visual literacy. And it's a kind of literacy that we need in our society just as we need other forms of literacy. My goal is to teach you to apply the skills of critical thinking and analysis to the experience of screening films. In short, we're going to treat films in this class the same way you treat Faulkner in an English class, as texts worthy of analysis and understanding. The difference is the texts you're going to watch in this class are texts that I'm sure you will enjoy. Let me give you a couple of examples before we end our first class. What I want to do for the remaining minutes is to talk about several films and see how we can analyze them and move beyond the surface level and get to what I called the latent level, that underlying subterranean level of meaning that lurks there only if you know how to see it. E.T., the Extraterrestrial, which came out in 1982, was one of the greatest hits in all of Hollywood history. If you control for inflation, it actually sold more tickets than Titanic. It was enormously popular. And so let me begin with a question for you. Why, during the 1980s, the decade when many of you were born, why, during the 1980s, were people overwhelmingly fascinated with a movie about an extraterrestrial? Why did people respond in such a way? Why was it the most widely seen movie in American history? What's going on? And if the identical film were made today, would you work under the assumption that it would be just as popular today? Or did it clearly speak to certain deep psychological and cultural needs? Okay. Yes. What do you think?
Well, it came out at a time when the generation that grew up with Star Trek and the original sci-fi shows of the 60s was mature, and the generation that was born during Star Wars, the 70s sci-fi films, it came out at a time, optimum time to capture both those generations.
Okay, so one argument might be that the attractiveness had to do with the genre and the desire of baby boomers to see the same kind of things they used to watch when they watched Twilight Zone and the like on TV. But I think there was a much deeper level of appeal, and that's what I want to talk about. On numerous occasions, Steven Spielberg has spoken of his fascination of our first rendezvous with extraterrestrial intelligent life. And that's been a theme that's dominated some of his movies, like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when at the very end you see the spaceship open up and you have humankind's first contact with extraterrestrial life. But in E.T., Spielberg tried to take this theme further. We get to meet these extraterrestrials now. And we learn not just about E.T., we learn about Spielberg himself. All creative works are self-portraits. All creative works depict in symbolic and distorted form an artist's inner struggles. But sometimes those artists embody the tensions of their culture. And that's what you call a great artist. Steven Spielberg is a good filmmaker, but what he's even better at is somehow speaking to his audience. That is, his psychological problems, his psychological needs, his fantasies clearly touch the mass audience in a way no one else's do. Okay. So we're going to take a look at those inner struggles. We know, you all know, who knows how we picked this up, I guess reading People magazine, that Steven Spielberg was reared in an affluent California suburb. None of us were. His parents divorced when he was a child, and he spent much of his formative years at the movies immersed in fantasy. And in E.T., we encounter an affluent suburban California family grieving quietly over the recent loss of their philandering husband and father, who has gone off to Mexico with his secretary. And so it is a film that begins with undercurrents of loss, need, emptiness, and the wish for reunion. So it's generally a light and cheerful film, but it has this subtext of unhappiness and neediness. Into this world, E.T. steps. He's a small, comical creature, replete with contradictions. He's immeasurably old and immeasurably young simultaneously. That is, he's old, wrinkled, and wise, and yet in a lot of ways he's just like a baby or a toddler. He's unsteady of foot, he doesn't know how to walk at first, he doesn't know how to talk at first, he has a taste for sweets, he drinks a beer from the refrigerator, you remember. He's just like a little kid, right? So he's both old and he's both young simultaneously. At first, Elliot, the boy protagonist of E.T., is frightened of this creature. But rapidly he takes him as a pet and becomes his inseparable companion. Indeed, the connection is so strong that they share thoughts, feelings, even cardiac rhythms. In psychoanalytic terms, E.T. is what is called a transitional object. He bridges the gap between the lonely child and the longed-for, idolized, all-good father. He returns from outer space to meet the child's needs. This is very much a child's film. You'll remember all the camera work is shot upward from a child's angle. The adult world is split into the kind, wise E.T. and every other adult. Adults are unempathetic, they're prohibitive, they're dangerous, they're authoritarian, and the symbol is, in all these upward shots, you always can see the keys on people's belts, the real symbol of adult authority. Spielberg focuses on these key rings because they're the symbol of the power that adults have. Clear divisions between adults and children, remote distance, these are the themes that Spielberg emphasizes. The child's wish for power and freedom is graphically depicted in the film, and adults are constantly foiled. It's a sort of Oedipal theme. With E.T. playing Peter Pan, another child-Superman mixture, the children can elude adult villains by flying. When E.T. must finally leave at the end, he lets us know his work has been completed. Elliot and Spielberg have been healed. I will always be here, he says, pointing to Elliot's heart, his head. So why now do you think this film was popular in the 1980s? The time you were born, growing up. Yes, please push the button.
I wasn't born and growing up. I think one of the reasons it hit people my age was because we were very much caught in the middle between childhood and adulthood, and that fear of who's left to take care of me. And things, although in hindsight may have seemed wonderful during the early parts of the Reagan era, were not so wonderful for young adults.
Okay, what I would like to suggest is that the vast transformations in family life, the rise of divorce, the sharp shifts in gender roles caused by feminism, that these produced a great deal of anxiety, and movies like E.T. were very reassuring. So the appeal wasn't simply the story of an extraterrestrial. It had to do with personal life. Thank you.